Welcome to our First Friday conversation. For more than 30 years, St. Thomas alumni and friends have come together for the First Friday Speaker Series luncheons to hear firsthand from the community's most interesting thought leaders. Now, we're delighted to share these conversations both online and in person. The leaders we invite to this series offered candid messages and unique perspectives on the common good, and provide interesting insights into what may be next for Minnesota and beyond. And I'm confident today's conversation will be no exception. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated our need to respond and adapt to unforeseen changes, including workplace transformations. Today's discussion will focus on surviving and thriving in an ever-changing professional world, and our guests will share lessons on building culture, connection, and careers. First, I have the pleasure of welcoming Ozzie Nelson. Ozzie is CEO of Nelson Worldwide, an award-winning firm delivering architecture, interior design, graphic design, and brand strategy services. Since becoming CEO in 2003, the firm has executed more than 40 mergers and acquisitions, taking Nelson from the rank of number 37 in the industry to top 10 with a growth of more than 500%. In 2019, Ozzie was named one of Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal's most admired CEOs. And next, I'll welcome Karyn McCoy, Associate Vice President of Alumni, Career, and Corporate Engagement here at St. Thomas. Karyn came to us from DePaul University, where she served as Assistant Vice President of the DePaul Career Center. Prior to DePaul, she held positions in alumni engagement at the Melbourne Business School at the University of Melbourne in Australia and the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Karyn's experience also includes being an adjunct professor specializing in career-related courses, and her passion lies in helping people and teams imagine what's possible. Ozzie and Karyn, thank you for being with us. We appreciate you sharing your time and your insights for this First Friday conversation. And thank you all for joining us. And now, please enjoy the conversation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. It's a pleasure to be here with Karyn. And I would say, given your announcement earlier this week and the fact that you will be moving on from St. Thomas, I want to just take an opportunity to thank you for everything that you've done for this institution. Today we'll be talking about opportunities for leadership, and I'm struck by just the bold moves that you've made in just such cohesive ways over 9 years. That's what great leaders do. And as one person in the community, I just want to thank you for everything that you've done. Today, as Dr. Sullivan indicated, we're going to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has changed workplace, but really as a backdrop of how it has changed career opportunities, some thoughts about what is different, and then some suggestions about how to best navigate career advancement. And then the best part will be we'll take some of your questions. So as we look at this topic, I think one of the things that is really important, and we'll talk about meta trends in a moment, trends that sort of transcend all industries. I think there's this idea that the office is going to go away in a very similar way that people thought that e-commerce would be the end of the physical retail store. And instead, what we've seen is this continuity between a consistent brand that goes from digital to physical, something that we call phygital. And you'll hear me refer to that a couple of times because I think it's really important. I think that there will always be an important place for the physical environment. It just will be an element that really needs to be much more integrated as we talk about culture and brand and connectedness. So the best way to predict the future, Abraham Lincoln said, is to create it. Another quote that came to mind, especially here in Minnesota, is Herb Brooks, who said, "Out of great challenge comes great opportunities," and that's what we have here. So the last 2 years, we have had great challenge. But I think that the pandemic will be remembered for a number of things, but one of it is the great accelerator. There really is no reason other than adapting to change and deciding to work differently that we could not have been this virtual 3, 4, 5 years ago. But it was the pandemic that pushed a much more virtual approach to work. And so we have a new future. And today's talk is really about how we can all create a very different future for each other and for ourselves in that environment. So a little bit of background. As Dr. Sullivan talked a little bit about our firm, we are leaders in 8 different segments of the industry, but for the conversation today, hospitality and retail in a lot of ways have been forerunners of what I believe we will see in workplace. Taking some of those into consideration, I think one of the things that's very interesting for our firm, where, imagine if 40% of your business was dependent on workplace, and then one day people stopped going to work. But we'd like to say that when the world shut down, that's actually when we went to work and had the opportunity to really collaborate with global companies about how they were going to navigate back into the office, what their ideas about the new workplace would be. And so a lot of what I'll talk about today is informed not only by research, but hand-in-glove relationships with global companies of all sizes. So here's some of the data. And this is a survey that is hot off the presses within the last 6 weeks. And it's a cross-section of different age groups, company sizes. And one of the things that's really interesting, I would encourage you, anytime you can look at one of these surveys, the data really doesn't move, whether it's individual companies that look within their company or looking across industries. So the salient points here are that 88% of people believe that work will change, whether that's change in the ways that it has changed or the change will actually be accelerated. 56% of people believe that they will work 2 days or less in the office. And 50% of people believe that workers will enjoy at least as much flexibility as they have today. I think one of the other things that's really important in terms of the place in time in which we sit is that this is the first time that we will have 5 generations in the workplace at the same time. And so when we talk about the workforce or we talk about the workplace, really important to understand what is the demographic distribution of our office. And just to dial a couple of those points up, here is some recent statistics from Gen Z, and reminder that Gen Z is people who are aged 10 to 25. Not surprisingly, they expect more diversity. Their idea of a feedback session is something that's 5 minutes or less. One of the statistics I love the most is Wi-Fi is more important than a working bathroom in the workplace. And then, as you would assume, they believe that technology is causing a lot of the generational gaps. I talk about that because I think, again, if your office environment or the career path that you're trying to appeal to is Gen Z or Gen Y or baby boomer, these are obviously very different audiences. I said that I would talk a little bit about the meta trends, and these are trends that globally, if you think about the way that the world is changing, these are things that you see readily around us, but I think increasingly will shape the way that we look at work and what draws people back into the office. In a minute we'll talk about the Great Resignation, but we sit at a time that is really interesting because not only is there all of this change that's happening, I think it's fair to say that employers don't want to make policies that are too strong and that repel a workforce that's very difficult to attract today. So there's this idea of not only what should work be, but how do we even attract people back into the office? So some of the common 5 trends that are happening in the world that we think will happen in workplace and we see happening every day is this idea of placemaking, belonging in placemaking, creating meaning around culture, brand, and a sense of belonging for folks. Amenities that drive community will drive workplace. If you think about the shopping centers that you go to or the communities that you go to, so much of that is about amenities, and amenities will play an increasingly important role of why people go into the office and what energizes them when they are in the office. Flexibility and versatility really are becoming table stakes. When people think 4 years ago, the idea of having flexibility in the office was a big deal. Today, it's just expected. Again, this idea of phygital, where physical and digital experiences come together to create a sense of connection, a sense of loyalty, a sense of belonging to the company, I think is really going to be critical. And there needs to be a consistent thread between the brand and the culture of the organization and how people experience that physically and what they see when they're in the office. And then look for the return of the old town square. People went to the town square as a way of connecting with other like-minded people in which they could collaborate, they could share ideas. That's a big part of what people will come back into the office for. So let's talk about, from a cultural standpoint, what is changing and what is different. In a moment, I'll give a little bit more detail about the Great Resignation. But I think it's fair to say one of the things that I believe has driven the Great Resignation is if you think about people constantly being on the treadmill or gerbil wheel, if you will, think about how competitive things like kindergarten have gotten, all the way through to you get your college degree, it's all about getting a job, and then it's all about a promotion. And all of a sudden, people sat at home for 2 years and had all the commute time, they had all the time that they had spent going from place to place to really reevaluate their lives. Never before in time has there really ever been that sort of break. And not surprisingly, people are really thinking about what are their core values, what is it that they want to do, and when you think about what their search is, the connection with an employer who has meaning, who has a culture that connects with them, really becomes very important. But again, we'll show you some of the statistics on the Great Resignation in a moment. Traditional career advancement has been really turned on its head. So you used to get a job, there was formal mentorship, there was formal advancement, you saw your boss every day, you were part of a class of people that came through the system, and now all of a sudden, for the last 2 years, everything has been virtual. And even when we go back to the office, if we go back in a hybrid fashion, that sort of consistent advancement, I believe, will forever be disrupted. And then managing remote teams from a virtual standpoint has really been a challenge. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Here are the statistics on the Great Resignation. 65% of all people are looking for new jobs today. And 88% of employers are seeing higher turnover than ever before. And there's some breakdown here in terms of which industries are the heaviest. Certainly, retail and hospitality have been hit the hardest, but I would say that there are almost no industries that have escaped the Great Resignation. And I think it's an important factor in reevaluating how to not only attract people into the office, but to how to re-engage them in general. Love this slide. Some of the frustration out there for managers. I think both sometimes remote teams are frustrated, but certainly you hear a lot of mainstream managers who are frustrated with this idea of managing from afar. I think in particular, baby boomers have a really difficult time, especially when they have been so used to having their teams around them. I think it's also fair to say that that is a generation that has a hard time trusting that people are working as diligently at home as they were in the office. So let's talk a little bit about what you can expect when you come back to the office, and how does that play into what career advancement and career pathing is going to look like. So I'd like to say, when you think about the office, think about what the office looked like 20 years ago when you had really heads down space. And then about 10 years ago, you started to get this living room that was in the front of the office. Now, I think the back of the office is going away and everything's going to look like the living room. You're going to, again, have this town hall where people connect, that there's going to be very little heads down space, but the office is going to be a place of collaboration, a place of meeting with clients, a place in which there is everything but heads down space, if you will. So I think a couple of trends when you look at career pathing that I think is important. Number one, in terms of the things that the pandemic will accelerate, is automation and technology. There was already 4 years ago, there was a statistic that 80 million jobs will be eliminated over the next decade because of automation. Jobs like self-driving cars or self-driving trucks or tellers that would be replaced. Look for that to happen all the more quickly because of advancements in the technology, but also it's a perfect storm coupled with the Great Resignation and so fewer people that want to do those jobs. One of the things that I think has been underrated in terms of how people advance their careers is those casual collisions that happen at the water cooler or walking into the building. Or one of the things that was noted to me is from a younger worker who said that they used to get this opportunity to collaborate or to interface with senior leaders just going into a meeting, before the meeting or after the meeting. In a Zoom world, we go on the screen, we do our business, and we're on to the next Zoom. So those, the next couple of slides we'll talk about what do you do now that you will not have that casual collision or that opportunity to raise your personal brand or to be seen as much as you were in the physical environment. And then I think it's really important to adopt a remote mindset, a work mindset. How has work changed? What are you missing in terms of a physical environment, and how do you get that? But just as importantly, in a world that is going to be more remote, even in places where it is a hybrid environment where you're in the office 2 to 3 days a week, there still is going to be a piece that's missing. And so how do you think, not only, I think there are still a segment of people that are thinking about going back, and I don't think we're ever going back. The world is forever changed by this. So what is that remote mindset, and how can you bring that to work when you are in your professional day? So a couple of thoughts about that. With the erosion of the casual collision, with the idea that workers pursuing a career path are seen less. Number one, volunteering for projects that increase visibility, probably a really good idea. And I think there's a great opportunity to couple the sense of connection that people are finding with purpose and the causes that corporations have, and bring those two together so that you are somebody that stands out in your work environment. I would say the workers have started this idea of virtual work and not wanting to go back into the office. And I think that's going to start a cycle now where employers will now say, well, if people are at home, it doesn't really matter where they are. And so this idea of not being the best in town, but the best in class is really important, because I think we are going to get to a point where competition is going to become more and more stiff, because there will be broader and broader geographies that employers will be able to select from. And then to this idea of automation and digital replacing certain parts of jobs, or certain parts of jobs being either offshored or sent to lower cost markets, avoiding parts of your career path that are easily commoditized. Now, for people who like to do the same things repeatedly, I would suggest that embracing change, being much more on an innovative edge is a way to drive much more value in terms of the way that you'll be seen in the future. I think it's really important. We talked about how many managers are really having a hard time with managing virtually, and to some degree bring a certain amount of I hate to use the word distrust, but distrust to how much work is actually happening at home. So to workers out there trying to stand out in a field, my suggestion would be co-design expectations for outcomes with your manager. Talk about what they expect to see at the end of a day or the end of a week. Be transparent about your schedule. Everybody expects that people are going to take opportunities during the day if they have to go to a doctor or they have to pick up the kids. The best way to address those issues is to be transparent about them. Let your manager know the times that they can expect you to be at your desk. And again, if you've co-created outcomes in the top part, it's less important when you're at your desk and more important about what the amount of work and the expectations that you're getting done. Virtual presentation skills are critical. So make sure that you have the right camera, the right background, that the camera and computer are at the right height, that you have the right microphone. This is now going to be your professional place of work at least half the time, and you want to be seen in the light that you want to be seen, and be conscious of the way that your virtual setting projects you. And then to this point of the workplace continuing to change, and there really continuing to be more and more change around us, embracing being a continuous lifelong learner, I think is the best way to continue for all of us to position ourselves in an ever-changing world. And so with all that, go advance your careers, and I look forward to the question and answer session with Karyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Ozzie. I appreciate those comments and giving us some context around this topic. And I think it's clear, flexibility, adaptability, versatility, they're here to stay. We were having a conversation earlier about change fatigue, and unfortunately that's not going anywhere. Change is here to stay, and it's only going to accelerate, as you noted. And I think that given the effects of the pandemic, given the generational shifts in the workforce that you mentioned, it really forces us to rethink the future of work, the future of our careers, and doing that in a really intentional and compassionate way. So I want to make note of a few key takeaways from your presentation. One is really make the most of your time in the office, right? Think about how you show up. If we're not going to be there all the time, how are we showing up? How are we helping to build community? To that end, communicate a lot, right? Whether you're the employee or the manager, how are you communicating expectations? How are you communicating your schedule? And then the third thing I took away is finding those ways to make yourself stand out, right? So engaging in lifelong learning, thinking about this idea of being best in town, or best in class versus best in town, because of the geographical walls disappearing, right?
Absolutely.
So much that we can dig into here. So I want to start with some of the questions that were submitted by the audience in advance. I also invite the audience, feel free to submit your questions live through the Q&A function. We will get to as many of those as we can. So first thing though, you talked a little bit about managing remote teams virtually and how challenging that can be. So what are your thoughts on what are the long-term impacts that we may see related to that? And how does it, in particular, how is it affected by either 100% virtual or 100% hybrid? Talk about that from a manager perspective.
Sure. And I think, and I love retail as an analogy for all of this, because hard to say whether we're shaped more, and I think ideally we're shaped equally by visiting a flagship store of a retailer or a great online experience. Those really need to go hand in glove. I think it's the same thing with managing people. I think the idea that it certainly can be done, it's funny to me the number of very senior people that we hired during the pandemic that it took me a year to actually meet in person, or a year and a half to meet in person. But I think what's really missing is that physical connection when you get a chance to build a relationship in person. So I think even for organizations that are 100% virtual, this idea of some kind of retreat time, some sort of check-in. I think even within, I think one of the things that's going to happen increasingly for organizations that have large office populations is they're not going to be able to get everybody in the office because they're going to shrink the footprint, but they'll lease space once a month, once a quarter, and that will be that time of kind of building camaraderie and building culture. I think it is so important. The less time that people have together, the more thought that goes into what is the culture of the organization? How do we live culture? Because if really all I'm doing is working for a Zoom screen for one company, I can just switch jobs and keep doing the same thing in my house. So I think it really is about this connection of purpose and culture, and working to really kind of measure that, because you don't, the old way of measuring that is you could see people walking around, you could see how engaged they are. This is much more difficult to do. So I think the more virtual, the more purposeful the focus on culture, connection, and kind of sprinkled in-person connection has to be.
So how does that relates to the point you made earlier in terms of the workplace becoming the culture place, right? And this idea of placemaking. Talk about that in the context of collaboration. What's the impact of that on collaboration, the culture, the collaboration, the connection? What's the impact?
Well, first of all, I think that, first of all, having the right technology tools is to supplement the in-person collaboration is really critical. I think this idea of equity in terms of people that are in the room and people that are on the screen, and how do we make sure that those are, everyone has an equal voice, if you will, and not just the people that are in the room. I think all of that really has to be modulated and choreographed to what the collaboration goals are. How do we collaborate on big ideas? Do we collaborate on an ongoing basis? What's the size of our collaboration teams? I think these are the things that we hear people rethinking all the time. And the reality is, the larger the group, the more likely you're going to be successful getting everybody in a room, because everybody becomes the sort of postage stamp size person on a screen.
Right. Now, how about, you mentioned the generational shifts. So one of the questions from the audience has to do with the difference in acceptance or adaptation to new work environments based on the age of our workers, based on the generation of our workers. And so how do you see that playing out in this?
Well, I think it's, we not only have the Great Resignation, we have more people retiring than ever before. One of the observations that I've heard made is that usually when you go through one of these sort of challenging times, the economy goes through a challenging time. And as you know, in the pandemic, it was a split screen in terms of, retail and hospitality died, but, Amazon and digital companies, really took off. And so many people who were retirement age had the opportunity to retire because the stock market did really well. And so part of this is people that are opting out are opting out. For those that aren't opting out, this is a new game. And my suggestion to each of those 5 generations is you are 1/5 of the people that work here. And you certainly have your own preference and your own point of view. But if we really want to build a collaborative environment, we have to be understanding of each other's differences. And we have to understand that our preference and our differences are just some of the preferences and differences.
That's a good segue to an audience that I focus a lot on, and that's those who are graduating, who are early in their career, newly coming into the market. And I'm curious, what tips would you give early career individuals in terms of how do they navigate this hybrid workforce, or completely virtual, perhaps. And is the advice that you would give to them, is that different than what you would give to others?
I think the earlier in your career, obviously, the less marketable you are, the less life experience you've had. Unfortunately, I think the more onus is on you to seek out and find those experiences. So those opportunities to go into the office, I like to think about having the opportunity to go in the office instead of having to go in the office. Those are really the opportunities to see things in a very different way. And while that may represent commute time and all the other things, I think those are great opportunities. Seeking out mentorship in a digital world, just outwardly asking people if they would be a mentor for you, creating a framework for what that looks like in a more virtual world. I also think that there's that, we talked a little bit about in the presentation, signing up for those extracurricular pieces that are going to distinguish you. Let's face it, in the 1960s world, the boss was able to see the people that came in early and the people that left late. In a virtual world, nobody sees that. So you really have to find a way to raise your profile in a way that people really do recognize your willingness to do the things that advance a career.
Okay. Along those lines, so one person who's joining us today observed that younger workers love remote work. They love the opportunity to have a hybrid workplace, to have flexible work schedules, and that on the other side, many managers see the need for more of an in-person presence. Now that's obviously making it quite simple, but what have been your observations around that, and how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one of the things that's been, I hear the point of view a lot of times that younger workers want more virtual work. I think a lot of that depends on what career they're in. So if I'm a programmer, there's no reason for me to leave my house. If I'm an aspiring real estate executive where I need to learn from the people in front of me, and I'm learning about the industry, and there's so much kind of passive information that goes back and forth just by having exposure to people. I'm not sure that those younger people don't crave some interaction. I also think that, again, I think the older worker, one of my great frustrations 10 years ago was we had all this technology and there was sort of a baby boomer mentality, and I can say that because I'm a baby boomer, that, wanted my people around me. I was sort of measured by the size of, my teams. And again, I think this idea of if you're not inspecting and if you're not watching, you can't trust the work that's being done. So I think this is like good communities and like great societies. It's all about differences and understanding these different points of view. And I do think that the older workers, and I would say that the one thing about the Great Recession is that I think the older workers are so starved for just good workers that they are much more flexible than they would have been 2 years ago. And I again, I would say to people on the younger side, I would question if your job is a job that was virtual before, could have been virtual before, like programming. How often do you really need to be in the office?
Okay, so let's flip things a minute. So one of our audience members has said that we are so focused on the experience of the virtual worker, right? We're looking at how do they make sure that their managers understand they're being productive, how do they communicate their results, how do they identify opportunities for face time, if you will, right? Well, what about the in-office worker in a hybrid environment and how awkward that can sometimes be?
Yep.
What advice do you have for those employees?
It's a really good question, and I think I've heard the expression, where you sit determines how you think, and I think there's a temptation for people that do come into the office with more regularity to think that's where things happen. And I think it is really important in a hybrid environment, even if you choose to be one of those people that's there 5 days a week, understand there's a lot of work that happens here. One of the things you and I were talking about is, while we were preparing for today, is about building social networks. Mm-hmm. And I think the in-person worker needs to understand that just because they see a group of people, that's not the social network, that's a segment of the social network. So they have to be, I think, stretching all the time to understand who are the people that aren't in the office, how do they connect with them, how do they weave a thread that's much broader than the people that are physically there.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to all the way to the other extreme then. We've talked a little bit about 100% virtual. We've talked about the hybrid workforce. So there's a question here about industries that simply can't be virtual, right? For example, healthcare. In some cases, you and I were talking about education earlier, and they're experiencing crises and staff shortages as well. So talk a little bit about those industries and the change that they might experience.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I challenge our teams to think about all the time is not thinking so much in broad strokes as thinking in terms of aspects of workflow, and even industries like healthcare, which are largely dependent on being in person. We've seen this boom in Metahealth, where a lot of the diagnosis can be done through the phone, mm-hmm. Or on the screen, and so I think even in those industries we're going to see this hybrid, and it's not a matter of thinking of industries that have to be in person as much as it is functions within industries that have to be in person, and I think that that has its own opportunity to really start to change the way the physical environment works. If we're only going to the doctor for certain functions, does that start to drive the proximity of the location to physical health? And what does that look like in terms of being much more bundled health, mm-hmm. where you can do a variety of things in person, as opposed to specialty where you're driving all the way for an eye exam or whatever that is.
The possibilities are endless going down that path. So we're not going to tackle that part of it. But I think that related to that, the connection here for me is healthcare. And we have an audience member who has said, generally, younger employees tend to have smaller living spaces. They are not as able to set up proper home offices. And so how are ergonomics and health and wellness of employees potentially going to be affected by that? And what does that mean for things like workman's comp and insurance?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably its own first Friday in terms of all of the implications there. But I think it's I think the hot topics there are, number one, what should the employer provide as a standard for virtual work? Where are the liability issues around that? That was always something that was waived a lot. 4 years ago, so we can't have people work at home because of the liability, and all of a sudden the pandemic comes and all of that goes away. Mm-hmm. So what are the real liabilities around that? And then beyond what the employer has to do, what should they be doing in that idea of really promoting health and an ergonomic environment? And I think that, again, is an unfolding story, but an important story.
Okay. And it's connected to the idea of what are the benefits, what are the values of an organization?
Yes.
And that's tied to this idea of the Great Resignation. And you and I have talked about some of the reframing of the Great Resignation as the Great Reassessment.
Yes.
right? And this is an opportunity for people to step back and say, do my values, does what's important to me connect with this organization? And so we're really thinking differently about that. So can you talk about what you're seeing as employers and employees are making some really intentional decisions about what's important and what they value?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I talked about flexibility being table stakes. I think this idea of a logo that gets slapped on the wall or mission and values getting slapped on the wall are not even table stakes. I mean, they're a huge gap in the ability to connect with today's worker. I think there's at all ages. It's not like it's just been the younger generation that's decided they want to be mission driven. It is across those 5 generation points that everybody wants. And again, I think this silence is a powerful thing, and people had some silence to really think, and I think they realized how much career noise, all the things that we do every day, in many cases stop them from identifying internally with the things that get them out of bed in the morning. And so once they were down that path, I think probably more than any other time in the last century, people are really looking, know that life is finite, know that at any time it can all, we can all be stuck at home. Mm-hmm. With the remainder of my life, what is it that I want to do, and what's the employer that I'm going to most connect to? I think that is the thing that you hear the most in terms of organizations that are successful today in retaining and attracting people.
Right. And that's where I think the idea of the great reassessment makes sense to me.
Absolutely.
It's all of us using that silence and taking that step back to say, what's important and what do I value, and where do I want to spend my time? Where do I want to give my energy? And so as we're all making those leaps, and we're seeing employees make great leaps, and as an employer, then we are having to onboard those new employees.
Yeah, and I think it forces employers to rethink, are our core values clear enough? Are we living our values? Because it's not only, obviously companies not only want to be, great companies not only do that, but now there's a whole other litmus test, is that clear enough for the people that are coming to work here? Mm-hmm.
Well, and so how do you, in a hybrid or a virtual workplace, what does onboarding look like? How do you, going back to culture and values and community and culture places, if we're onboarding people in a virtual environment, how do you create that culture piece? How do you create that sense of belonging?
Yeah, I'll tell you some of the ways that we're trying to do it in our company and some of the best practices that I've seen. First of all, I think wherever possible, early in someone's onboarding, the ability to make physical connections with people, I really do think is critical. I think being much more deliberate about virtual connections that you make, if in fact it's impossible to get physically with the person, how do we connect them with the virtual network within the organization? How do we align them? How do we find out about the things that they value as well as the things that we value, and make sure early on we're really making those connections? And I think it's about much more frequent check-ins, because again, in a non-virtual world, we were able to see things all the time and make all kinds of observations. We've got to be much more purposeful, particularly when we're planting the seed of hopefully growing roots with an employee, there's frequent check-in and there's rich dialogue around how that experience is going.
So is that connected in your opening remarks? You talked a little bit about a remote work mindset. The fact that we were forced into remote work And so now we've all kind of adapted and we understand what remote work is, but we now need a remote work mindset. So talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think on one hand, it is amazing how quickly we adapted with almost no notice. GDP was up in the first year. I mean, productivity actually got better. Productivity is one measure. It's like anything in life. The difference between taking classes and apprenticing and learning a craft as opposed to just hacking at something. I think that we've been pushed to work virtually and we've been doing the best that we can. But I think, again, some of the things that we talked about, even in some of these questions, really thinking about the people that I don't interact with that I would have interacted with in the office. How do I create a connection for them? As an employer, how do I create connections? Just not worrying about just getting by, if you will. It's working fine. Mm-hmm. What are we missing from when we were in the office, and how do we simulate that virtually? And what's the cadence in which we come together, both in terms of teams, but also as an entity? I think those are things that really have to be thought through to get the impact of the phygital environment, if you will.
I like that language, the phygital. And so one other thing that I want to touch on is the idea of lifelong learning and continuous learning. That's been around for a long time, but I think it has become more important, more critical for all of us in terms of advancing our careers. And so if you are talking with, if you're addressing the workforce now, whether it's an individual contributor or a manager, and you were to say, focus your energy on this kind of learning right now. Here are the things you should be thinking about, the skills. What would those be? I think one thing with the lifelong learner is, I think there was this notion, 25 years ago that you get your degree and you're done. Number one, we're never done. So I think coming to the table with this idea that wherever you are today, you're on a journey, thinking about where your industry is going, where the pertinent elements of the external world are going, and that should push you to where your energies should go. Mm-hmm. I've heard it said that the world will never have as little change as it does today. That's obviously hyperbole in just how there will be continue and faster change. This idea that people have change fatigue, I can appreciate that, but that is the world that we live in today. Mm-hmm. So I think the more people can, one, readily accept that change is here to stay, two, knit together and really let themselves be visionaries in terms of where they think the world is going. And if that, and do a lot of research on where the world's going, but be your own career director in terms of what are the skill sets that I think I should have. I think the other thing that I would say is we live in a time in which there's probably never been more choice. If you look at any given industry, there are so many different directions that you can go in. One, equipping yourself to take advantage of as many of those choices as you can, but being very intentional to try to align where the world or the industry is going and where your passions are, I think is really important. Okay. I like that idea of being your own career director. All right, we have time for one more question. So I'd love for you to, as we wrap things up, what advice would you give to our seniors who are graduating this year as they're navigating the job search process, as they're entering the workforce? What advice would you give to them?
I think it's one, you are hitting the labor market at a time that is kind of a dream of all folks in terms of how, in a lot of ways, record unemployment, people really have an opportunity, if you will, to write their own ticket within reason. I guess the biggest thing I would say is to not let that be a crutch. I think that this will all change, and we'll get back to some more normalized times. Prosperity. I thought the other day with all of the things going on in the Ukraine, and I saw a poll the other day that Republicans and Democrats have never been more aligned on something. And unfortunately, crisis sometimes pulls us together. Prosperity can make us petty and self-focused. So there is a temptation, I would think right now, if I was coming into the job market, that the world is really all about me and I have all these opportunities. Don't let that be a distraction to really the things that you should be focused on in terms of building the richest career that you can, despite the fact that right now things are pretty easy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. Thank you so much.
And I was looking and doing some research about you and preparing for this conversation. I came across a quote from you in 2019. And the quote says, "People are either reacting to what's going on around them or shaping it. And we live in times where shaping it is more exciting." And I think that quote still applies today.
I would agree.
And I think that what gives me hope and what keeps me going is the fact that we're all figuring it out together. None of us are doing this alone. So I appreciate the conversation.
Me too, Karyn. It was great.
And before we say goodbye, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for attending and for providing us questions. We hope you can join us at the next First Friday webinar on April 1st for an engaging conversation with Sherry Ballard, CEO of Minnesota United FC, as she talks about her new role and building a winning organization through comprehensive excellence. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.